Hello, and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the northern direction by Kupiansk, where the Russian forces managed to make a small advancement in the direction of the village of Sinkivka. This area was recently captured by the Ukrainian forces in a counterattack towards Lemen-Pirshi, and in return, the Russian forces then launched yet another attack, recapturing the positions lost. We then move on to the direction of Vesely, to the north of Bakhmut, where the Russian forces advanced slightly more in the northern direction by the railways in the direction of Vyimka. So we see Russian forces attacking in three different directions: to the north here, to the east of Vesely, to the north of Vesely itself, and to the west of Vesely in the direction of the village. So Vesely is being attacked from two different directions, and the Russian forces are also advancing by the railways in the direction of Vyimka. Moving on to the northern flank of Bakhmut, the Russian forces have managed to advance further in the direction of Bohdanivka. The village itself is still under full Ukrainian control. However, the first line here has been captured by the Russian forces. As such, there's little distance between the Russian positions and Bohdanivka itself from three different directions: from the northwest, the north itself, and directly to the east. So with this, we see that the Russian forces will likely launch a three-part offensive where they will attack the Bohdanivka from three different directions. This is likely to heavily pressure the Ukrainian forces and attack from multiple directions, which will allow them to spread out and concentrate large forces without them being concentrated in one area, which will make it easy targets for the Ukrainian artillery. To explain it in a very simple sense, if the Russian forces concentrated some units here to the northwest and attacked from the road here, from the northeast and attacked through the forest areas, and from the east attacking again through the forest lines, then the Ukrainian forces would have to attack all three directions, so they would have to split up their own forces as well. Where if the Russian forces were to attack from one direction all at once, then the Ukrainian forces could again concentrate their own forces towards that direction. And since the Russian forces actually outnumber the Ukrainian forces in this direction after the recent reinforcements being sent to this area by the Russian forces, they are able to concentrate larger amounts of forces than the Ukrainians and pressure them heavily from three different directions. So this seems to be an tactic to gain the largest possible advantage in this direction using what they have available. As for the southern parts, as I reported in my previous video, there were some offensive operations by the Russian forces in the Dacha area. As such, the Russian forces have now managed to advance in this direction, capturing this part right here and getting closer to gaining full control over the southern Dacha area of Bakhmut. The Russian forces continued their pressure on the flanks of Bakhmut. We also see some footage from the Klishivka area where Russian forces are fighting in the forest areas, capturing Ukrainian trenches and fortified positions within the forest line. As such, we see that there's a lot of fighting happening despite no territorial changes, as the territorial changes are not clear as of yet. But there's a lot of fighting happening in the forest areas here to the northwest of Klishivka. This is why there's been no updates in the area despite fighting continuing. We then move on to the direction of Avdiivka, where the Russian forces, after capturing the quarry area, now have advanced further into the residential areas in the southeast of Avdiivka, where they've managed to capture half of the defensive line the Ukrainian forces had here and are now advancing into the residential area itself. With this, the Russian forces have made their first entrance to Avdiivka city proper for the first time since the civil war in 2014. Since then, no DPR forces, no pro-Russian forces, and no Russian soldiers have ever been inside Avdiivka. This is the first time. And to get a proper overview of how heavy the fighting here by Avdiivka is, we have this image here which shows all of the areas where the Russian forces have stormed Ukrainian positions in a time frame of just this week. Approximately 14 different assaults through the front line by Avdiivka from the north of Stepova and down south to the Pervomaisk direction. 14 assaults in 7 days, that is 2 assaults a day throughout this past week, and these assaults continue. We then move on. In the Marinka direction, we have a new video which yet again shows Russian soldiers waving the flag of the Russian Federation in the western outskirts of the city. So that is now the third time they're waving the flag at the western outskirts. Every time they clear more buildings here, the western outskirts, they wave the flag yet again. And with this is the final one here in the southern part. There's the final part in the north, which the Russian forces have yet to conquer. But so far, the Russian forces have managed to gain full control over the southern part, as I mentioned in a video a week ago. Since then, clearing operations have been undergone, and now it is completely clear of any Ukrainian forces. And all of this fighting comes at a cost, as we see yet again. There's another satellite image of the front line, this time at Marinka, where we yet again see complete destruction of all of the civilian buildings in the area. The area is completely demolished. There's no building back what was once here, but there's always place for the future once the war ends. And with the complete end of fighting in Marinka proper, the Russian forces have started assaults in the direction of Pobieda here to the south. There's also been reports of fighting taking place, and the Russian forces have managed to advance in the direction of Novomikhailivka from the north, where the Russian forces have managed to capture some of these fortified areas, which have gone back and forth between the Russian and Ukrainian forces over the past months. So we see that the Russian forces will continuously try to push now that more units have been freed up with the complete capture of the Marinka direction. We also see continuous assaults by the Russian forces towards Novomikhailivka from the east and from the south. So with this, we see that there's pressure towards Novomikhailivka from three different directions, from the north, east, and south. This is similar to the Wagner tactics here to the north of Bakhmut, where in the direction of Yakovlivka and other areas, the Russian forces would actually attack from three different directions. After the capture of Yakovlivka, the Russian forces, or Wagner forces mainly, used an assault tactic where they attacked from the north to cover the high ground here to the northeast of Soledar. They attacked straight ahead from the positions to the east of Soledar, and they also stormed positions of the Ukrainian forces from the south, so from three different directions. This is the same tactic the Russian forces are now using towards Novomikhailivka, with attacks from the south, east, and north to try and repeat the success of the Wagner forces. We then move on to the Kherson direction, where there's been reports of fighting across the Dnieper River. However, there's been no territorial changes, and it becomes more and more difficult for the Ukrainian forces to hold on to their foothold across the Dnieper River, because despite the fact that the Ukrainians are heavily trying to hold their positions and are constantly sending reinforcements and supplies across, it becomes more and more difficult the colder it becomes with the weather in southern Ukraine. As we can see here in this picture here, it is very difficult in the winter season with how these ports are frozen in the coastlines. Not frozen enough to pass through, just frozen enough to make it difficult for speedboats to operate. It will require a lot of preparations for the Ukrainian forces to consistently pass through, but as the winter goes on, it becomes more and more difficult. Finally, there is an archival video of Russian Air Force operating here by the Inholets River on the Kherson region, the western bank of it. We see that the Russian forces, during the Ukrainian offensive here by Kherson, the Ukrainian forces actually managed to push the Russian forces back across the Inholets River, where we saw a lot of fighting here in the area. The Ukrainian forces managed to capture areas here right across the Inholets River, after which they pushed the Russian forces back, and the Russian forces actually forced them to enter in this sort of salient, where the Ukrainian forces managed to capture a bunch of these villages. And since then, we see this video here, a Russian jet flying over the Kherson region. This footage is from last year, archival footage. This is from an area where the Ukrainian forces passed the Inholets River and started taking up positions in villages that at the time were under Russian control. So the Russian forces were pushed back, and they baited the Ukrainian forces into this area where they had it as a zone where they just grinded down Ukrainian forces with their air force. Because at that time, the Ukrainians hadn't received a lot of air defense from the Western forces. Therefore, they weren't able to completely shoot down any of the Russian forces. fighter jets, helicopters, and so on fighting by the front line, and therefore we saw airstrikes like this one. And this has completely stopped since the West started sending a lot of air defense with both the IRIS-T systems, Patriot missile systems, and others, which now prevents the Russian forces from flying within 50 kilometers of the front line, without being at a huge risk of being shot down. So the reason I show this video, despite it being a year old and pretty much not reasonable to talk about, it shows how the situation has changed and how the Russian forces were forced from that sort of close air support into the FAB style air support that we now see, which is significantly less effective than what we saw in the video. As with the fighting we see in the video, the Russian forces were able to drop multiple bombs heavier than the FAB 1500 with much further accuracy and much more direct concentration. With that, they're able to directly hit concentration of forces at a very close range and with little to no chance of running away for the Ukrainian forces. Meanwhile, today, with the FAB 1500s, FAB 500s, and so on, it is much more difficult to actually hit the targets due to how long it takes from the bomb being launched until it actually hits the target. And as such, Ukrainian forces can easily run away and disperse if they know one is coming. They likely do not know one is coming until it is detected by radars, and they can also be shut down. But in the end, not having direct fire support from jet planes decreases the amount of advantages the Russian forces have in these operations. But at the same time, we see this increased amount of Russian operations all throughout the Donbass region. But that is clearly the focus here. The Russian forces are almost only fighting within the Donbass region with their own offensive operations, all throughout from the Marinka direction and northwards all the way to the Kupiansk direction. Although this part is in the Kharkiv region, it is in connection with the southern parts by Liman. The Russian target is clearly to gain full control over the Donbass region, and they may even be planning to do so over this winter period. They hope for the cold weather to continue so that they can continue their operations. We see that they've managed to gain control over Marinka. Next is Novomikhailivka, Uledar, Avdiivka, Bakhmut here to the west towards Chasiv Yar, Ivanivsk, and so on. We have the northern parts by Siversk, the Liman direction, and the Kupiansk direction. All of these are clear targets by the Russian forces. They either plan to gain control over the front line, gaining control over these important fortified areas by the front line, and then on the next time they launch an offensive, whether it be summer or winter 2024, they'll likely go on to fight for the Sloviansk-Konstantinivka line. And with that, we can see that the Wagner-Prigozhin prediction of when they will take the Donbass being 2 years from the point where fighting was taking place in the Bakhmut direction would be accurate. And then he claimed 3 years for everything that's east for the Dnieper River. So with that, we can see that he may actually have had a point, but we're yet to see, as anything can change in war and nothing is really predictable. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.